now being in Germany, talking about privacy on a web conference like this. You have heard about people asking whether privacy is still the real goal. It was 20 years ago. You have been pretty enraged hearing about so-called post-privacy so-called post-privacy advocates. What's your stand on that?
I mean, I think we can be post-privacy for some people when we're post-privilege. I mean, it's like in the 80s there were these guys that didn't believe that they could get HIV, so they never wore condoms because they could never be affected by it. And so now we have people that say they'll never be affected by the surveillance state, and they freely give up their data and they give up their friends' data, and they don't acknowledge that there's a transitive risk, just like with HIV. And just like with HIV, we need a massive education campaign, because what has occurred in the past from surveillance states is incredible suffering on a scale which is equivalent to a disease of society. And it's really scary, actually, to imagine that we have seen this happen in the 20th century, and we pretend for a second that a person who is physically not as strong as someone else is going to be treated equally all the time, simply because the law says so. Well, how about when the law doesn't say that? Well, because it doesn't say that right now, so how well will that go? And so looking at this, when people talk about this idea that, well, it's not a good business plan to do it distributed, so we must centralize it, we have to ask ourselves if the most important thing in the world is to have a good business plan, or if it is to have a strong civil society, which includes aspects of a so-called free market, but is socially constrained enough that it's not a free market for, you know, say, genocidal weapons. We have some limits on those things, and we should have some limits on them, because if we don't have limits on them, it isn't really possible to maintain a democracy. It isn't possible, even with the veil of voting, to be able to call it a democracy when you don't have freedom of speech, freedom of thought, when you don't have freedom of movement, and all of those things are changed. And so when post-privacy people talk about that, I like to sort of suggest to them that they go and talk to a sexual assault victim and say, you know, sorry that you were sexually assaulted, but gosh, you know, now that that happened to you, I think it's clear we live in a post-consent world. And that's, you know why no one would say that is because it's total bullshit. And I think it's important to call them out on that. Their privilege does not mean everyone shares that privilege. And we don't live in a post-consent world, and we shouldn't live in a post-consent world. And so when people talk about post-privacy, they need to talk about how they're waving their privilege around in a way which is not helpful to society and is in fact harmful. And on top of that is completely and patently ridiculous if you look at the history of the 20th century, but of all the centuries that were before it. And so I sort of mock and ridicule people that suggest that, but I also think they present a serious threat because they believe, in some cases, that it is legitimate to have no privacy. And that's very scary to me, because they also contradict themselves by wearing clothes and having curtains on their windows and using SSL for their banking transactions. And they don't really recognize the trade-offs there. And so I probably shouldn't give them too much credit,